Okay, everyone, before we get started, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And don't forget to leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. That way, YouTube will keep feeding you stories just like this one. All right, let's dive in. Working the North Slope oil fields up in Alaska. Well, that ain't for everybody. The isolation just eats at you after a while. You're looking at nothing but white tundra and frozen darkness for months and months. I'd been doing pipeline maintenance up near Prudhoe Bay for around 6 years or so when this whole thing went down. It was February of 2018. The money was good, real good, which is why guys like me, Brad and Tommy, kept signing up season after season. We were a tight crew. We had each other's backs through blizzards and equipment failures, the kind that could kill you faster than you could even radio for help. That particular rotation, we'd just wrapped up a week-long repair job on a section of pipe. It had developed stress fractures from the constant freeze-thaw cycles. The company put us up in one of those prefab shelters, about 40 miles south of Deadhorse, right off the Dalton Highway. You know, that ice road the truckers use. The drive back should have been cake. Nothing out of the ordinary. We'd done it 100 times before in Brad's souped-up Ford F-350, the kind with chains on all 4 tires and enough heating power to keep you from turning into a human popsicle. Tommy was stretched out across the back seat, trying to catch up on some sleep. I was riding shotgun, keeping Brad company while he navigated through what was turning into a pretty nasty snowstorm. Visibility was maybe 30 feet on a good stretch. The headlights just bounced right off the swirling snow, creating this hypnotic tunnel of white that made you feel like you were flying through outer space. We were about 2 hours into the drive when Brad just slammed on the brakes, hard enough to send Tommy flying into the back of my seat and nearly through the windshield. Barely visible through the storm was a figure stumbling along the side of the road. No vehicle in sight, no emergency lights flashing, just this person in what looked like a heavy parka, moving in that desperate, uncoordinated way people do when hypothermia starts to kick in. Brad pulled over right away. You just don't leave anyone out in that kind of weather, not when it's 40 below zero and getting worse. Tommy jolted awake, cursing up a storm about the sudden stop, but he clammed up real quick when he saw what we were looking at. The 3 of us sat there for maybe 5 seconds, watching this guy struggle through knee-deep snow about 20 yards ahead. His parka was one of those old military surplus ones, olive green with fur trim around the hood that kept whipping around in the wind. What struck me as weird right off the bat was how he was walking. Not the stumbling gait of someone fighting the cold, but this mechanical, repetitive motion, like he was following a track that only he could see. Brad laid on the horn twice, but the guy didn't even turn his head, just kept moving forward, 1 foot after the other, arms hanging loose at his sides. "Jesus Christ, he's gonna die out there," Tommy said, already reaching for his door handle. Brad threw the truck in park, and we all piled out, the wind hitting us like 1,000 tiny knives. Even with our heavy gear on, the cold tried to crawl through every gap, every zipper. We started jogging toward the guy, calling out to him, our voices getting swallowed up by the storm. When we got within 10 feet or so, Brad grabbed him by the shoulder to turn him around, and that's when things got really sideways. Started getting really strange. The man's face was pale. I mean, paper white, but not like he had frostbite. His eyes were this cloudy gray color, like dirty ice, and they seemed to look right through us, like we weren't even there. He had maybe 3 days' worth of stubble, dark against that unnatural white skin, and his lips were moving constantly, forming words we couldn't hear over the howling wind. But it was the scar that made Brad take a step back, a jagged line running from his left temple down to his jaw. The kind of mark that tells you someone survived something they probably shouldn't have. Sir, are you okay?" Tommy shouted, waving his hand in front of the man's face. No response whatsoever. The guy just stood there swaying slightly, those cloudy eyes fixed on something beyond us, beyond the storm, beyond everything we could see. His lips never stopped moving, and when I leaned in closer, fighting every instinct that was telling me to back away, I could just make out what he was repeating. 247, 247, 247, over and over, like a broken record. Brad and Tommy exchanged a look. We'd all heard stories about people going crazy from the isolation up here, but this was different. This felt wrong on a level I couldn't even begin to explain. We had to get him in the truck, though, ethics aside, leaving him out there would mean explaining a frozen corpse to the state troopers, and none of us needed that kind of paperwork. It took all three of us to guide him to the Ford. He didn't resist, but he didn't help either. Just let us move him around like he was a mannequin. His body was stiff and cold even through the heavy parka. The weird thing was, he didn't shiver. You spend enough time up in the Arctic, you know that shivering is your body's last defense against the cold. When that stops, you're in big trouble. But this guy, his skin was ice cold, and he wasn't shivering at all. We got him in the back with Tommy, who pressed himself against the far door like he was trying to phase right through it. Brad cranked the heat up to maximum and pulled back onto the Dalton. For about 10 minutes, nobody said a word. The only sounds were the heater fan on full blast and those lips, still moving, still forming those same numbers. Then Tommy cleared his throat and said what we were all thinking. "Guys, doesn't he look like that missing snowmobiler from a couple years back? The one they found the sled, but they never found the body." Brad's knuckles went white on the steering wheel. I remembered that story too. Everybody who worked the slope did. February of 2016, a local guy named Christopher Vaughn went missing during a solo snowmobile trip. They found his sled wrapped around a tree about 15 miles from where we'd picked up our passenger. Blood on the seat. Drag marks leading into the woods that just stopped abruptly. Search teams looked for 2 weeks straight before calling it off. In that kind of cold without shelter, you've got maybe a few hours tops. They declared him dead, had a memorial service and everything. His brother worked for one of the drilling companies, used to drink at the same bar in Deadhorse. He said Christopher had that exact same scar from a childhood accident involving a boat propeller. The more I looked at our silent passenger in the rearview mirror, the more my gut churned. Same scar, same face shape, even the same color eyes. Though Christopher's had been brown in the photos, not this milky gray. The shelter appeared through the storm like some kind of metal oasis, its yellow lights barely able to penetrate the white wall of snow. We radioed ahead to let them know we were coming, but we got nothing but static, which wasn't all that unusual in weather like this. The building was one of those modular units that the oil companies scatter all along the pipeline route. Basically, a reinforced shipping container with bunks, a kitchenette, and a communication setup. Brad parked as close to the door as he could, and we got ready to move our passenger inside. That's when he spoke for the first time, his voice gravelly and wrong, like someone talking to you from underwater. "Can't go in. Not yet. Not until 2:47. Tommy actually jumped, banging his head on the doorframe. But we weren't about to leave anyone out in the truck to freeze, regardless of what they thought they wanted. It took Brad bear hugging him from behind, while Tommy and I each took an arm. But we managed to get him through the door. The second we crossed the threshold, he went completely limp, dead weight that nearly took us all down to the floor. We laid him out on one of the bottom bunks, and Brad went to check the radio while Tommy put some water on for coffee. I stayed with our guest, checking his pulse, slow but steady, and trying to make some sense of what we'd just found. Up close, under the harsh fluorescent lights, more details jumped out. His fingernails were way too long, curved, and yellowish, like he hadn't cut them in months. There was no smell, though, which bothered me more than it probably should have. Someone who'd been wandering around in the wilderness should have stunk of sweat, body odor, something. But there was nothing, just this neutral, almost sterile absence of scent. His parka pockets were empty except for a single item that made my chest tighten up. A snowmobile key on a leather fob, the kind they sold at the Dead Horse gas station. The leather was cracked and weathered, and branded into it were the letters C. Vaughn and the year 2015. Tommy came back with the coffee and saw me holding the key. His face went white, and he set the mugs down so hard that coffee sloshed everywhere. "That's not possible," he whispered, but we both knew it was right there in my hand. Brad came back from the radio room shaking his head. The storm was interfering with everything. We were stuck until it passed, probably another 8 to 10 hours. That's when the power flickered, just once, but enough to make us all look up at the ceiling. These shelters had backup generators that kicked in automatically, so power issues were pretty rare. The lights steadied, but something had definitely changed in the room. Our passengers' eyes were wide open, staring directly at the clock on the wall. 11:30 p.m. His lips started moving again, faster this time. That same mantra. 2:47. 2:47. Tommy grabbed my arm hard enough to leave a bruise. "We need to get out of here," he said. "Right now. Storm or no storm." But Brad was already shaking his head, pointing at the window, where the snow was coming down so thick you couldn't even see the truck parked 10 feet away. We were trapped, and somewhere deep down in my lizard brain, I had this feeling that that was exactly what was supposed to happen. The next few hours crawled by like molasses. We took turns watching our visitor while trying to maintain some pretense of normalcy. Brad made sandwiches that nobody ate. Tommy cleaned his tools for the 3rd time. I kept checking the weather outside, hoping for any kind of sign of a break. The man never moved from the bunk. He just lay there with his eyes locked on that clock, his lips moving in their endless countdown. Around 200 a.m., exhaustion hit us hard. Tommy volunteered for first watch while Brad and I grabbed bunks on the opposite side of the room. I didn't think I'd be able to sleep, but the adrenaline crash knocked me out cold. I woke up to Tommy shaking me violently, his eyes wide with panic. The clock read 2:46 a.m. Brad was already up, standing by the door with a wrench clutched in his hand. "He's gone," Tommy gasped. "I just looked away for a second to check the coffee pot, and when I turned back, the bunk was empty." We searched the shelter, all 40 feet of it, but there was nowhere to hide. The man had simply vanished. That's when we heard it. 3 deliberate knocks on the metal door. Slow, measured, the kind of knock that says someone knows exactly what they're doing. 2:47 a.m. The knocking came again, this time from the window on the north wall, then the south window, then back to the door. It circled the shelter, like something was walking around outside, testing each entrance. Brad gripped the wrench tighter. "That's impossible," he said. "Nobody could survive out there without gear." But we all knew our visitor hadn't exactly been normal. The knocking stopped at 2:48, leaving us in a silence so complete it felt like pressure in our ears. We stayed frozen like that until dawn, nobody willing to be the first to move. When the storm finally broke around 700 a.m., we made a discovery that sent us racing for the truck. There were no footprints anywhere around the shelter, not leading away from the door, not under the windows. Nothing. The snow was pristine, untouched, but Tommy never made it to the truck. When Brad and I turned around, he was just gone. No sound, no struggle, no tracks, just empty air where he'd been standing 2 seconds before. We tore out of there and didn't stop until we hit Fairbanks, filed a missing person report, told them about picking up the stranger, but left out the part about him possibly being Christopher Vaughn. The troopers found Tommy's body 3 days later, 15 miles from the shelter, in the exact spot where Vaughn's snowmobile had crashed. Frozen solid, lips blue with cold, with drag marks in the snow that just stopped. Music. The nights at mile 237 fuel stops stretched out endlessly, each one blurring into the next until time just lost all meaning. I'd been working there since early November, manning the counter while Arctic winds rattled the windows and 18-wheelers rolled past like ghosts on the Dalton Highway. The job paid well enough for a college student trying to save up some money. And the owner, an old guy named Eugene, didn't ask too many questions when I needed to pick up some extra shifts. Most nights passed without anything happening out of the ordinary. Truckers grabbing coffee, locals filling up their tanks, maybe the occasional tourist who'd gotten turned around in the storm. The station itself wasn't anything to write home about. 2 pumps out front, a small convenience store stocked with overpriced snacks, and a bathroom that barely functioned when the pipes weren't frozen solid. Everything changed on my 3rd Wednesday there. The clock had just hit 2:00 a.m. when I noticed a pair of headlights cutting through the blizzard outside. An old Chevy pickup, rust eating through its faded blue paint job, pulled up to pump number 4 and just stopped dead. The driver didn't get out, didn't reach for his wallet, didn't even bother to turn off the engine. He just sat there, visible only as a dark silhouette through the frost-covered windshield. After about 10 minutes, I figured maybe he was having some kind of car trouble, or maybe he'd just fallen asleep. But when I grabbed my jacket to go check on him, the truck suddenly lurched into reverse and disappeared back into the storm. Strange, sure, but in a place like that, strange was kind of relative. I made a note in the logbook and went back to restocking the energy drinks, figuring that would be the end of it. The following Wednesday rolled around, bringing with it another blizzard, even worse than the last one. Visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet, and the wind made the whole building creak like an old ship. Eugene had warned me about nights like these. Said sometimes the weather got so bad that even the truckers would hunker down rather than risk the highway. I was counting inventory in the back room, just trying to stay busy, when I heard the familiar rumble of an engine outside. The clock on the wall showed exactly 2:00 a.m. Through the security monitor, I watched that same blue Chevy pull up to pump number 4, same spot as before, and the driver did the exact same thing. Absolutely nothing. This time, I got a better angle on the camera, so I could make out a few more details. The man was wearing what appeared to be a heavy winter coat with the hood pulled up, and his hands were gripping the steering wheel at precisely 10 and 2. He never adjusted his position, never reached for the radio, never even seemed to breathe. I let it go on for 15 minutes this time before deciding to go out and approach him. The moment I took a step toward the door, keys in hand, the truck's reverse lights flared to life. By the time I pushed my way through the wind and snow to reach pump number 4, all that was left were tire tracks already being erased by the storm. The whole thing left me feeling unsettled in a way I just couldn't put my finger on. There was something almost mechanical about his movements, or rather, the lack of them. It was like watching a video on loop. I spent the rest of my shift jumping at every set of headlights that passed, but that blue Chevy didn't come back. When Eugene came in for the morning shift, I mentioned it to him, trying to keep my tone casual, like it was no big deal. He just shrugged and said, "We get all kinds out here. especially during storm season, but I couldn't help but notice that he avoided making eye contact when he said it, and his fingers were drumming nervously on the counter. By the third Wednesday, I'd pretty much prepared myself for what was coming. I'd even switched shifts with Jasmine specifically so I could be there at 200 a.m., although I didn't tell her the real reason why. The security system at the station was ancient but still functional, a setup from the early 2000s that recorded everything on a loop, overwriting the footage after 7 days. I'd figured out how to save clips to a USB drive, and I had one ready and waiting right there in my pocket. The storm that night was lighter than the others, just steady snow instead of a full-blown blizzard, which meant that there was a lot better visibility. I positioned myself behind the counter with a clear, unobstructed view of pump number 4, pretending to read a magazine while I waited for him to show. At 1:58 a.m., I heard that distinctive engine rumble growing louder and louder as it approached from the north. The blue Chevy materialized out of the darkness like it had been summoned, pulling into the exact same spot with practice precision. This time I was ready with the camera controls, zooming in as close as the old system would allow. What I saw made my skin crawl and sent shivers down my spine. The man in the driver's seat wasn't just still, he was impossibly still. No subtle movements from breathing, no shifting around to get comfortable, no fidgeting or checking the mirrors. His face remained hidden beneath that heavy hood, but his hands on the wheel just looked wrong somehow. The skin had this grayish tint, even accounting for the poor camera quality, and the fingers seemed way too rigid, like they'd been frozen in place. I recorded everything, my pulse hammering in my ears as I watched him just sit there for exactly 10 minutes. Then, right on schedule, the reverse lights came on. But this time, instead of backing straight out, the truck turned ever so slightly, and for just a split second, the driver's side faced directly toward the camera. The hood fell back just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his face, and what I saw sent me stumbling. Hi everyone, before we get started, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. All right, let's get into it. Working up on the North Slope oil fields in Alaska ain't for everybody. That isolation, it just kinda eats at you after a while. You got nothing but white tundra and frozen darkness for months and months. I'd been doing pipeline maintenance up near Prudhoe Bay for around 6 years when this whole thing went down. Happened in February of 2018. The money was good. I mean, real good. Which is why guys like me, Brad and Tommy, kept signing up season after season. We were a tight crew, real tight. Always had each other's backs through blizzards and those equipment failures that could kill you faster than you could even get a radio call out for help. That particular rotation, we had just wrapped up a week-long repair job on a section of pipe that had developed stress fractures from all the constant freeze and thaw cycles. The company put us up in one of those prefab shelters, you know, about 40 miles south of Deadhorse, right off the Dalton Highway. That ice road all the truckers use. The drive back should have been totally routine. I mean, we'd done it 100 times before in Brad's souped-up Ford F-350, the kind with chains on all 4 tires and enough heat to keep you from turning into a human popsicle. Tommy was sprawled out across the back seat, finally catching up on some sleep, while I rode shotgun, keeping Brad company as he navigated through what was shaping up to be a pretty serious snowstorm. Visibility was maybe 30 feet on a good stretch. The headlights were just bouncing right off the swirling snow, creating this kind of hypnotic tunnel of white that made you feel like you were flying through outer space. We were about 2 hours into the drive when Brad just slammed on the brakes hard enough to send Tommy slamming into the back of my seat from the back of the truck, barely visible through the storm. There was this figure stumbling along the side of the road. No vehicle in sight, no emergency lights, just this person in what looked like a heavy parka, moving in that desperate, kinda uncoordinated way people do when hypothermia starts kicking in. Brad pulled over immediately. I mean, you just don't leave anybody out in that kind of weather. Not when it's 40 below and getting worse by the minute. Tommy kinda jerked awake, cursing about the sudden stop, but he shut up quick when he saw what we were looking at. The three, all right everyone, before we get started, make sure you smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. And don't forget to drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. That way, YouTube will keep feeding you awesome stories just like this one. Now, let's dive right in. Working up in the North Slope oil fields of Alaska. Well, it's definitely not for the faint of heart. The isolation, it just kinda creeps up on you after a while. I'm talking nothing but endless white tundra and frozen darkness stretching out for months and months. I was doing pipeline maintenance up near Prudhoe Bay for around 6 years or so when this whole crazy thing happened. It was February of 2018. The money was fantastic, seriously good money. And that's why guys like me, Brad and Tommy, kept signing up season after season. We were a tight-knit crew. Like family, we always had each other's backs. Whether we were battling blizzards or dealing with equipment failures that could kill you quicker than you could even radio for help. That particular rotation, we had just wrapped up a week-long repair job on a section of pipe that had developed some pretty serious stress fractures thanks to the constant freeze and thaw cycles. The company stuck us in one of those prefab shelters. You know, those metal boxes, about 40 miles south of Deadhorse, right off the Dalton Highway. It's that ice road those truckers use. The drive back should have been completely routine. We had made that trek 100 times before in Brad's souped-up Ford F-350, the kind with chains on all 4 tires and enough heat blasting to keep you from turning into a human popsicle. Tommy was passed out, sprawled across the back seat, trying to catch up on some much-needed sleep, while I rode shotgun, keeping Brad company as he steered us through what was turning out to be a pretty nasty snowstorm. Visibility was, maybe, 30 feet on a good stretch. The headlights just bounced right off the swirling snow, creating this hypnotic tunnel of white that made you feel like you were flying through outer space. We were about 2 hours into the drive when Brad suddenly slammed on the brakes. He hit them so hard that Tommy went flying into the back of my seat, bouncing off the windshield, barely visible through the storm. There was a figure stumbling along the side of the road. No vehicle in sight, no emergency lights flashing, just this person bundled up in what looked like a really heavy parka, moving in that desperate, uncoordinated way that people do when hypothermia is starting to set in and shut things down. Brad didn't hesitate. He pulled over immediately. You just don't leave anyone out in weather like that. Not when it's 40 below and just getting worse. Tommy jerked awake, cursing about the sudden stop, but he shut his mouth real quick when he saw what we were all staring at. The 3 of us just sat there for maybe 5 seconds, watching this guy struggle through knee-deep snow maybe 20 yards ahead. His parka was one of those old military surplus ones, olive green with fur trim around the hood that kept whipping around like crazy in the wind. What struck me as odd right away was the way he was walking. It wasn't the stumbling gait of someone just fighting the cold, but more like this mechanical, repetitive motion, almost like he was following a track that only he could see. Brad laid on the horn twice, but the guy didn't even flinch, didn't turn his head. He just kept moving forward, one foot after the other, arms hanging loose at his sides. Jesus Christ, he's gonna die out there, Tommy said, already reaching for his door handle. Brad threw the truck into park, and we all piled out, the wind hitting us like 1,000 tiny knives stabbing into every bit of exposed skin. Even with all of our heavy gear on, the cold was trying to crawl through every gap, every zipper. We started jogging toward the guy, calling out to him, but our voices were just getting swallowed up by the storm. When we got within 10 feet or so, Brad grabbed his shoulder to turn him around, and that's when things got seriously weird, really quick. The man's face was pale. I mean, paper white, ghostly pale, but not like frostbite pale. His eyes were this cloudy gray color, like dirty ice, and they seemed to be looking right through us, like we weren't even there. He had maybe 3 days' worth of stubble, dark against that unnaturally white skin, and his lips were moving constantly, forming words, but we couldn't hear anything over the wind. But it was the scar that made Brad take a step back, a jagged line running from his left temple down to his jaw, the kind of mark that tells you someone survived something they probably shouldn't have. Sir, are you okay? Tommy shouted, waving his hand right in front of the man's face. No response. The guy just stood there, swaying slightly, those cloudy eyes fixed on something far beyond us, beyond the storm, beyond everything. His lips never stopped moving, and when I leaned in closer, fighting every instinct that was screaming at me to back away, I could just make out what he was repeating. 247, 247, 247 over and over again, like a broken record. Brad and Tommy exchanged a look. We'd all heard stories about people going crazy from the isolation up here, but this was completely different. This felt wrong on a level I couldn't even begin to explain. We had to get him in the truck. Though, ethics aside, leaving him out there would mean explaining a frozen corpse to the state troopers, and none of us needed that kind of paperwork. It took all 3 of us to basically guide him to the Ford. He didn't resist us, but he didn't exactly help either. He just let us move him around like a mannequin. His body was stiff and ice cold, even through the thick parka. The really weird thing was, he wasn't shivering. If you spend enough time in the Arctic, you quickly learn that shivering is your body's last line of defense against the cold. When that stops, you're in serious trouble. But this guy, his skin was like ice, and he wasn't shivering even a little bit. We got him in the back with Tommy, who pressed himself against the far door like he was trying to disappear right through it. Brad cranked the heat up to the max and pulled back onto the Dalton. For about 10 minutes, nobody said a single word. The only sounds were the heater fan on full blast and those lips still moving, still forming those same numbers. Then Tommy cleared his throat and said what we were all thinking. Guys, doesn't he look like that missing snowmobiler from a couple of years back? The one they found the sled, but they never found the body. Brad's knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel. I definitely remembered that story. Everyone who worked the slope did. February 2016, a local guy named Christopher Vaughn went missing during a solo snowmobile trip. They found his sled wrapped around a tree about 15 miles from where we had picked up our passenger, blood on the seat, drag marks leading into the woods that just stopped abruptly. Search teams looked for 2 weeks before finally calling it off. In that kind of cold without any shelter, you've maybe got a few hours tops. They declared him dead, had a memorial service and everything. His brother worked for one of the drilling companies, and he used to drink at the same bar up in Deadhorse. He said Christopher had that exact same scar from some kind of childhood accident with a boat propeller. The more I looked at our silent passenger in the rearview mirror, the more my gut just churned with dread. Same scar, same face shape, even the same color eyes. Although, Christopher's had been brown in the photos, not this milky gray color. The shelter appeared through the storm like some kind of metal oasis, its yellow lights barely penetrating the white wall of snow. We radioed ahead, but we got nothing but static, which really wasn't unusual in weather like this. The building was one of those modular units that the oil companies scatter along the pipeline route. Basically, a reinforced shipping container with bunks, a kitchenette, and a basic communication setup. Brad parked as close to the door as he possibly could, and we got ready to move our passenger inside. That's when he spoke for the very first time. His voice was gravelly and wrong, like someone talking through water. "Can't go in. Not yet. Not until 2:47. Tommy actually jumped, banging his head hard on the doorframe, but we weren't about to leave anyone out in that truck to freeze, regardless of what they wanted. It took Brad bear hugging him from behind, while Tommy and I each grabbed an arm, but we finally managed to muscle him through the door. The second we crossed the threshold, he went completely limp, dead weight that nearly took us all down to the floor with him. We laid him down on one of the bottom bunks, and Brad went to go check the radio while Tommy put some water on for coffee. I stayed with our guest, checking his pulse, which was slow but steady, and trying to make sense of what we had just found. Up close, under the harsh fluorescent lights, even more details jumped out. His fingernails were way too long, curved, and yellowish, like he hadn't cut them in months, or maybe even longer. There was no smell, though, which bothered me more than it probably should have. Someone who had been wandering around in the wilderness should reek of sweat, body odor, something. But there was nothing. Just this neutral, almost sterile absence of any scent. His parka pockets were completely empty except for a single item that made my chest tighten up. A snowmobile key on a leather fob, the kind they sold at the Dead Horse gas station. The leather was cracked and weathered, and branded into it was C. Vaughn 2015. Tommy came back with the coffee and saw me holding the key. His face went white, and he set the mugs down so hard that coffee sloshed everywhere. "That's not possible," he whispered, but we both knew that it was right there in my hand. Brad came back from the radio room, shaking his head. The storm was interfering with everything. We were stuck here until it passed, probably another 8 to 10 hours. That's when the power flickered, just once, but it was enough to make us all look up at the ceiling. These shelters had backup generators that kicked in automatically, so power issues were pretty rare. The lights steadied, but something had definitely changed in the room. Our passenger's eyes were wide open, staring directly at the clock on the wall. 11:30 p.m. His lips started moving again, faster this time. That same mantra, 2:47. Tommy grabbed my arm hard enough to leave a bruise. "We need to get out of here," he said. "Right now, storm or no storm." But Brad was already shaking his head, pointing at the window where the snow was coming down so thick you couldn't even see the truck parked 10 feet away. We were trapped, and somewhere deep down in my lizard brain, I had the feeling that this was exactly what was supposed to happen. The next few hours crawled by like molasses in January. We took turns watching our visitor while trying to maintain some kind of pretense of normalcy. Brad made sandwiches that nobody even touched. Tommy cleaned his tools for the third time. I kept checking the weather outside, hoping to see any sign of a break in the storm. The man never moved from the bunk. He just lay there with his eyes locked on that clock, lips moving in their endless countdown. Around 200 a.m., exhaustion hit us all really hard. Tommy volunteered to take the first watch while Brad and I grabbed bunks on the opposite side of the room. I didn't think I'd be able to sleep, but the adrenaline crash knocked me out cold almost immediately. I woke up to Tommy shaking me violently, his eyes wide with raw panic. The clock read 2:46 a.m. Brad was already up, standing by the door with a wrench clutched tightly in his hand. "He's gone," Tommy gasped. "I just looked away for a second to check the coffee pot, and when I turned back, the bunk was completely empty." We searched the entire shelter, all 40 feet of it, but there was absolutely nowhere to hide. The man had simply vanished into thin air. That's when we heard it. 3 deliberate knocks on the metal door. Slow, measured, the kind of knock that says someone knows exactly what they're doing. 2:47 a.m. The knocking came again, this time from the window on the north wall, then the south window. Then it went back to the door. It circled the shelter like something was walking around outside, testing each and every entrance. Brad gripped the wrench even tighter. "That's impossible," he said. "Nobody could survive out there without gear." But we all knew that our visitor hadn't exactly been normal. The knocking stopped at 2:48, leaving us in a silence so complete it felt like pressure in our ears. We stayed frozen like that until dawn, nobody willing to be the first one to move. When the storm finally broke around 700 a.m., we made a discovery that sent us racing for the truck. There were absolutely no footprints anywhere around the shelter. Not leading away from the door, not under the windows, nothing. The snow was pristine, completely untouched. But Tommy never even made it to the truck. When Brad and I turned around, he was just gone. No sound, no struggle, no tracks, just empty air where he had been standing 2 seconds before. We tore out of there and didn't stop until we hit Fairbanks. We filed a missing person report, told them all about picking up the stranger, but we left out the part about him possibly being Christopher Vaughn. The troopers found Tommy's body 3 days later, 15 miles from the shelter in the exact same spot where Vaughn's snowmobile had crashed. Frozen solid, lips blue, with drag marks in the snow that just stopped abruptly. The nights at mile 237 fuel stop stretched on endlessly, each one bleeding into the next until time itself lost all meaning. I'd been there since early November, manning the counter while Arctic winds rattled the windows and 18-wheelers rolled past like ghosts on the Dalton Highway. The job paid well enough for a college student trying to save up some money, and the owner, an old guy named Eugene, didn't ask too many questions when I needed to pick up some extra shifts. Most nights passed by without any incident. Just truckers grabbing coffee, locals filling up their gas tanks, maybe the occasional tourist who had gotten turned around in the storm. The station itself wasn't really much to write home about. 2 pumps out front, a small convenience store stocked with ridiculously overpriced snacks, and a bathroom that barely functioned when the pipes weren't frozen solid. Everything changed on my 3rd Wednesday working there. The clock had just struck 2:00 a.m. when I noticed headlights cutting through the blizzard outside. An old Chevy pickup, rust eating away at its blue paint job, pulled up to pump number 4 and just stopped there. The driver didn't get out of the truck, didn't reach for his wallet, didn't even turn off the engine. He just sat there, visible only as a dark silhouette through the frost-covered windshield. After about 10 minutes, I figured maybe he was having car trouble, or maybe had just fallen asleep behind the wheel. But when I grabbed my jacket to go out and check on him, the truck suddenly reversed and disappeared back into the storm. Strange, sure, but in a place like that, strange was kind of relative. I made a quick note in the logbook and then went back to restocking the energy drinks, figuring that was going to be the end of it. The following Wednesday arrived with another blizzard, even worse than the last one. Visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet, and the wind made the whole building creak like an old ship. Eugene had warned me about nights like these, said sometimes the weather got so bad that even the truckers would hunker down rather than risk trying to drive the highway. I was counting inventory in the back room, just trying to stay busy, when I heard that familiar rumble of an engine outside. The clock on the wall showed exactly 2:00 a.m. Through the security monitor, I watched that same blue Chevy pull up to pump number 4, same spot as before, and the driver did the exact same thing. Absolutely nothing. This time, I got a little bit of a better angle on the camera, and I could make out some more details. The man was wearing what appeared to be a really heavy winter coat with the hood pulled up, and his hands were gripping the steering wheel at precisely 10 and 2. He never adjusted his position, never reached for the radio, never even seemed to breathe. I let it go on for about 15 minutes this time before I decided to go out and approach him. The moment I took a step toward the door, keys in hand, the truck's reverse lights suddenly flared to life. By the time I pushed my way through the wind and snow to reach pump number 4, there was nothing left but tire tracks that were already being erased by the storm. The whole thing left me feeling really unsettled in a way that I couldn't quite explain. There was something mechanical about his movements, or lack thereof, like watching a video playing on loop. I spent the rest of my shift jumping at every set of headlights that passed by, but the blue Chevy didn't come back. When Eugene came in for the morning shift, I mentioned it to him, trying to keep my tone as casual as possible. He just shrugged and said, "We get all kinds out here, especially during storm season." But I couldn't help but notice that he avoided making any eye contact with me when he said it, and his fingers were drumming nervously on the counter. By the third Wednesday, I had completely prepared myself. I had even switched shifts with Jasmine specifically, so I could be there at 2:00 a.m., even though I didn't tell her the real reason why. The security system at the station was ancient but functional. It was a setup from the early 2000s that recorded everything on a loop, overwriting all the footage after 7 days. I had figured out how to save clips to a USB drive, and I had one ready in my pocket. The storm that night was a lot lighter, just some steady snow instead of a full-blown blizzard, which meant that there was better visibility. I positioned myself right behind the counter with a clear view of pump number 4, pretending to read a magazine while I waited. At 1:58 a.m., I heard it, that distinctive engine rumble growing louder as it approached from the north. The blue Chevy materialized out of the darkness like it had been summoned from another dimension, pulling into the exact same spot with practiced precision. This time, I was completely ready with the camera controls, zooming in as close as the old system would actually allow. What I saw made my skin crawl. The man in the driver's seat wasn't just still. He was impossibly still. There was absolutely no sign of any movements from breathing, no shifting around to get comfortable, no fidgeting or checking the mirrors. His face remained hidden beneath that heavy hood, but his hands on the wheel looked wrong. Somehow, the skin had a grayish tint, even taking into account the poor camera quality, and the fingers seemed way too rigid, like they had been frozen in place. I recorded everything, my pulse hammering in my ears as I watched him sit there for exactly 10 minutes. Then, right on schedule, the reverse lights came on, but this time, instead of backing straight out, the truck turned slightly, and for just a second, the driver's side was facing directly toward the camera. The hood fell back just enough for me to catch a quick glimpse of his face, and what I saw sent me stumbling backward into the cigarette display. The features were human, but they were all wrong. Sunken eyes that didn't reflect any light, skin that looked like old, dried leather, and an expression of just complete emptiness. No recognition, no emotion, nothing that even suggested a living person was sitting behind that wheel. The truck vanished into the night before I could even recover my composure. I spent the next hour replaying the footage over and over, trying to convince myself that I had somehow misunderstood what I had seen, that the poor lighting and the old camera had just played tricks on me, but each viewing only confirmed my initial impression. Whoever, or whatever, was sitting in that truck. It just wasn't right. I saved multiple copies of the recording and then started digging through the station's old logbooks, going back months, then years. Eugene kept meticulous records in a storage closet located behind the break room, dusty binders filled with delivery schedules, maintenance reports, and incident logs dating all the way back to the station's opening in 1987. That's when I found the first mention. December 1993, a note about a customer complaint regarding an abandoned vehicle at pump number 4 during the 200 a.m. hour. The description matched perfectly. Blue Chevy pickup, lone male driver, never exits the vehicle. The entries appeared sporadically after that, always on Wednesdays, always during winter storms, always at exactly 200 a.m. The real shock came when I found a folder that was labeled Incident Reports, Law Enforcement, tucked way back behind the older logs. Inside were photocopied police reports, missing person flyers, and newspaper clippings. One caught my attention immediately. An article from January of 1982 about a local man named Walter Hicks, who had disappeared during a severe blizzard. He had been driving home from his job at a mining camp when his truck, a blue 1988 Chevy Silverado, vanished somewhere along the Dalton Highway. Search parties found absolutely no trace of him or his vehicle, despite all of their extensive efforts. The article even included a photo of Walter, and even in the grainy newspaper reproduction, I recognized those sunken features. But it was the very last document in the folder that made me drop everything and reach for my phone. Someone had actually run the truck's license plate about 2 years ago and attached the results. The license plate belonged to Walter Hicks, and according to the DMV records, it had been registered to a vehicle that had been declared missing in January of 92 over 30 years ago. I tried calling Eugene immediately, but his phone went straight to voicemail. The next Wednesday was looming just 2 days away, and I couldn't make up my mind whether to quit immediately or stay to confront whatever it was that kept returning to pump number 4. Curiosity won out, along with a strange sense of obligation, like I needed to understand all of this for Walter's sake, wherever he really was. I spent those 2 days researching everything that I could possibly find about the disappearance. Walter had been 28 years old when he vanished, and he had been working rotating shifts up at the Red Dog Mine. He had left behind a wife and an infant daughter. The search efforts had been severely hampered by the blizzard that night, with visibility being near zero and temperatures dropping to 40 below. One detail from the police report really stood out to me. Walter's last radio contact with the mining camp had mentioned stopping for gas. Although he never specified exactly where, the timeline would have put him near mile 237 around 200 a.m., right when the storm hit its peak. I also discovered something else in the newspaper archives. 3 other people had gone missing along that same stretch of highway over the years. All of them during winter storms, all of them late at night, and none of them were ever found. Wednesday arrived with completely clear skies for once, stars visible through the station windows, and the temperature was hovering around -20. I had convinced myself that maybe the clear weather would break the pattern, that whatever it was that brought Walter's truck back only came with the storms. But at 1:45 a.m., clouds rolled in from absolutely nowhere, bringing snow that fell in thick, heavy sheets. By 1:55, the visibility had dropped to almost nothing, and I knew that he would come. I had already prepared everything. Fresh batteries in my flashlight. My phone was fully charged. Eugene's number on speed dial, and a baseball bat from the storage room was tucked behind the counter. At exactly 200 a.m., those familiar headlights pierced through the snow. The blue Chevy rolled up to pump number 4 with that same mechanical precision, and Walter, or the thing that used to be Walter, sat behind the wheel in his eternal vigil. This time, I wasn't going to wait. I grabbed the flashlight and the bat, took a deep breath, and pushed my way out into the storm. The cold hit me like a physical force, stealing my breath and making my eyes water instantly. Snow swirled in chaotic patterns, reducing the world to just a white void that was broken only by the dim glow of the station lights and the idling truck. As I approached pump number 4, fighting against the wind with every single step, I noticed something that hadn't been visible on the cameras. The snow around the truck was falling differently, creating a perfect circle where not a single flake touched the vehicle. Even stranger, the windows showed absolutely no fog from breathing, no condensation from body heat. The interior just looked as cold as the air outside. I reached the driver's side door, my flashlight beam catching that terrible face in profile. Up close, Walter's features were even more disturbing. Skin like old parchment stretched tightly over. Bone, eyes wide open, yet seeing absolutely nothing. Lips slightly parted, as if frozen mid-sentence. I raised my hand intending to knock on the window, and that's when everything went completely haywire. The instant my knuckles tapped the glass, the entire gas station lost power. The pumps went black, silent. The building behind me was swallowed by the sudden darkness, and even my flashlight sputtered, then died. In that instant, absolute darkness. I heard the truck door creak open for the first time. The emergency generator should have kicked in within seconds, but the darkness just lingered, heavy and suffocating. I stumbled backward, swinging the baseball bat blindly, fumbling with numb fingers, desperately trying to get my flashlight working again. Then, impossibly, I saw light coming from inside the station. Not the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights I was used to, but a soft, pale glow radiating from the windows. Through the falling snow, I could just make out a figure standing inside, perfectly still, facing outward. The proportions were off, somehow too tall, and impossibly thin. But I recognized the heavy winter coat and the gaunt, hollow face. Walter stood inside the locked gas station, on the wrong side of the front window, staring out at me. Frost began to spread across the glass from where he stood, forming intricate patterns that crept outward like frozen veins. But the truly horrifying part was that I could still hear the truck idling behind me, the engine running smooth and steady. I turned my head just enough to confirm what I already knew. The driver's seat was empty, the door hanging open like a silent scream. When I looked back at the station, Walter had moved closer to the glass, close enough that I could see every horrifying detail of his ruined face. Those empty eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my chest constrict with pure, unadulterated panic. The sound that came next will haunt my nightmares forever. A voice like wind whistling through a frozen pipe, muffled by the glass, but clear enough to understand. Still looking for pump 4. Each word came out slowly, labored, accompanied by more frost spreading across the window until the entire storefront was a solid sheet of white ice. I backed away, slipping on the snow-covered ground. The baseball bat felt useless in my shaking grip. Behind me, the truck's engine suddenly revved, headlights flashing in a rhythm that seemed almost like Morse code. The pale glow inside the station began to pulse in sync with the lights, and I realized with growing horror that Walter wasn't alone in there. Shadows moved behind him, other figures in winter gear, all standing at the windows now, 4 of them total, including Walter, matching the number of missing persons I'd read about. They all stared out with those same empty eyes, mouths moving in unison to form words I couldn't hear over the howling storm. The frost on the windows began to form letters, spelled out in ice. Help! Us! Find! The way! I ran, not back to the truck, not toward the highway, but around the building to the employee entrance, fumbling with my keys while those dead eyes tracked my every movement through every window. The door finally gave way, and I burst inside, slamming it shut behind me and throwing the deadbolt. The emergency lights suddenly flickered to life, revealing an empty store. No figures at the windows, no frost on the glass. Everything normal except for the thunderous pounding of my own heart. But the truck was still out there. I could hear it idling, right at pump 4, trembling. I pulled out my phone and called 911, babbling about intruders, power outages, anything to get anyone else there. While I waited, I grabbed the USB drive with the security footage and stuffed it into my pocket. Then I noticed something that made my stomach churn. The clock on the wall read 2:47 a.m., but according to my phone, only 10 minutes had passed since the power went out. The responding officer found nothing. No truck, no footprints except mine, no frost damage to the windows. The next morning, I handed in my resignation to Eugene, packed my belongings, and left Alaska for good. But sometimes, on winter nights when the snow falls heavy, I still dream about Pump 4 and those words traced in ice. I never found out what they were looking for, and honestly, I hope I never do. October of 2019 was the month everything changed between my dad and me. We'd been planning this moose hunting trip up in Alaska's Copper River Basin for months. It was supposed to be our first real father-son bonding trip since I'd moved to Seattle for work 3 years earlier. I'm 28. I do consulting, and if I'm being honest, I hadn't spent more than a single weekend with the old man since college. He'd been hunting that particular region for over 20 years. He knew every ridge and creek like they were extensions of his own backyard. We drove up from Anchorage in his trusty old Chevy Silverado, rifles secured, camping gear packed tightly. Both of us were genuinely excited about disconnecting from the world for 5 full days. The plan was simple enough: track some moose, hopefully get lucky with a clean shot, and just enjoy the pristine wilderness without the constant intrusion of cell towers or work emails buzzing in our pockets. The first day unfolded exactly as we'd hoped. We hiked roughly 6 miles from our parking spot and found a solid campsite near a narrow creek that carved its way through a valley surrounded by dense spruce and birch trees. Dad had that confident swagger he always got when he was in the woods, pointing out animal tracks, explaining the intricate wind patterns, and sharing stories about previous hunts in the area. The weather was crisp, but not brutal, maybe 35 degrees, with clear skies and that perfect autumn light filtering down through the trees. We set up our tent, organized our gear, and spent the evening planning our route for the next morning while sharing a thermos of coffee spiked with a generous shot of whiskey. Everything felt normal, peaceful even. We were both tired from the hike, talking quietly about family stuff, work stresses, and life in general. Neither of us had any idea that we were already being watched. The weirdness started on day 2. We'd been hiking for about 3 hours, following a game trail that snaked its way up through a series of rocky outcrops. Dad stopped dead in his tracks, staring at something about 30 yards ahead. His expression shifted from casual interest to genuine confusion. When I caught up to him, I saw what had grabbed his attention: scattered pieces of what had once been a caribou. But unlike any kill I'd ever seen before, the bones were picked completely clean, almost surgically precise. But the strangest part was the way the pieces were arranged. They weren't just randomly scattered, the way they would have been after a normal predator kill. Instead, they formed this weird, unsettling pattern, almost as if they'd been deliberately placed in a rough circle around a flat boulder. The skull sat right in the center, empty eye sockets staring up at the cold, gray sky, and the larger bones radiated outward like spokes on a macabre wheel. Dad knelt down next to the remains, running his fingers along the unnaturally clean bone edges. He'd been hunting for over 20 years, seen plenty of bear kills, wolf packs feeding, even mountain lion attacks. But this was different. The bones were too clean, too organized, and there wasn't a single track anywhere in the soft earth around the site. Not even a partial paw print or a single scuff mark. "Kevin," he said quietly, using my full name, which he only did when he was seriously concerned. "I've never seen anything like this. Whatever did this? It's big enough to take down a full-grown caribou, but smart enough to not leave any evidence behind." We spent another 10 minutes examining the area, circling wider and wider, but found absolutely nothing. No fur, no blood trail, no disturbance in the surrounding vegetation. It was as if the animal had simply materialized, arranged these bones with surgical precision, and then vanished into thin air. We tried to shake it off and continue our hunt, but the discovery had clearly rattled both of us. Dad kept glancing back toward the bone site, and I caught myself scanning the tree line more frequently than usual. About 2 miles further up the trail, we found another kill, this time a ptarmigan. But again, the remains were arranged in that same unnatural pattern. The small bones formed a perfect miniature circle around a smooth river stone, with the tiny skull positioned exactly in the center. What made it even more disturbing was that ptarmigans are ground-dwelling birds, easy prey for foxes or hawks, but there were no feathers scattered around, no signs of a struggle. Nothing that would indicate a normal predator-prey encounter. Dad picked up one of the delicate wing bones and held it up to the light, showing me how cleanly it had been stripped of meat. "This is surgical work," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. No animal does this kind of precision cleaning naturally. The pattern continued throughout the day. We found 5 more kill sites, each one more unsettling than the last. A ground squirrel arranged around a piece of quartz, a marten's bones forming a perfect circle around a flat piece of shale. Each site was immaculate, sterile almost, with that same eerie precision that made the hair on my arm stand on end. What really got to me was the escalation. The kills were getting fresher as we moved deeper into the basin. The first caribou had been there for days, maybe weeks, but the last few sites still had that metallic smell of recent death clinging to them. Dad started walking differently, keeping his rifle ready, constantly checking behind us. Neither of us wanted to admit it out loud, but we both knew something was tracking our movements, staying just far enough ahead to prepare these grotesque displays for us to find. It was like we were being led deeper into its territory, following a trail of increasingly fresh kills that served as both a warning and an invitation. That night, we made camp in a small clearing surrounded by thick spruce trees. Both of us were too on edge to venture any further. Dad insisted we keep the fire burning all night, taking turns on watch, even though we'd never done that on previous camping trips. I drew the first shift, sitting with my back against a fallen log, rifle across my lap, listening to every snap of branches and rustle of leaves in the darkness beyond our firelight, around 200 A. During Dad's watch, I woke up to the sound of him whispering my name urgently. When I opened my eyes, he was pointing toward the opposite side of the clearing, his face pale in the flickering orange glow. "There," he breathed, "between those 2 big spruces. Don't move too fast, but tell me what you see." I turned my head slowly, following his gaze, and that's when I saw them. 2 enormous yellow eyes reflecting our firelight, positioned about 8 feet off the ground, completely motionless. They weren't the typical green eye shine you'd expect from a deer or moose, but this intense, almost golden color that seemed to pulse with intelligence. The eyes watched us for what felt like hours but was probably only 15 minutes. They never blinked, never moved, just maintained that steady, calculating stare that made my skin crawl. Dad had his rifle trained on the spot, but neither of us could make out any body shape or outline in the darkness behind those eyes. Whatever was watching us was massive. The eye placement alone suggested something significantly larger than any wolf or bear I'd ever encountered. The strangest part was how absolutely silent it was. No breathing sounds, no movement of vegetation, no shifting of weight from one foot to another. Just those unblinking eyes studying us with what felt like predatory patience. When dawn finally started to break and the first gray light began filtering through the trees, the eyes simply vanished. One moment they were there, the next they were gone, as if they'd never existed at all. We searched the area thoroughly once we had enough light, but found no tracks, no disturbed vegetation, no physical evidence that anything had been there. Day 3 changed everything. We'd been hiking for about 4 hours, both of us jumpy and exhausted from the sleepless night. When we reached the ridgeline overlooking the main valley, Dad was using his binoculars to scan for moose sign when he suddenly went completely rigid. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, handing me the binoculars with shaking fingers. "Tell me I'm not losing my mind." I adjusted the focus and looked where he was pointing. And there it was. Standing on the opposite ridge, maybe 800 yards away, was the largest wolf I'd ever seen. But calling it a wolf doesn't really do it justice. This thing was enormous, easily the size of a small horse, with a massive head and shoulders that seemed too broad for any normal canine. Its fur was almost black, except for these weird silver markings along its spine that caught the sunlight like metal. What made my heart race was the way it was standing, completely still, facing directly toward us, like it had been waiting for us to reach that exact spot. The wolf stood there for maybe 2 minutes, just watching us with what must have been its own incredible vision. Even at that distance, I could feel the weight of its attention, like it was cataloging every detail of our appearance and behavior. Dad was fumbling with his rifle, trying to get a clear shot, but the range was too far for any reliable accuracy. Then, without any warning or gradual movement, the wolf turned and began walking along the ridgeline with this fluid, almost flowing gait that didn't look natural. It moved like liquid shadow, covering ground impossibly fast, while maintaining perfect balance on terrain that would challenge even an experienced mountain climber. What terrified me the most was how it would stop every 100 yards or so, turn back toward us, and wait just long enough for us to track its movement before continuing. It was clearly demonstrating that it could outmaneuver us effortlessly, that it had been controlling this entire encounter from the beginning. That's when everything clicked into place for me. The bone arrangements, the fresh kills getting progressively newer as we moved deeper into the basin, the silent nighttime surveillance, and now this calculated display of dominance. We weren't hunting in its territory. We were being hunted by it. This wasn't some random predator protecting its domain. This was something far more intelligent and deliberate. The wolf had been shadowing us for the entire trip, staying just close enough to monitor our movements while leaving those grotesque calling cards to announce its presence. Dad must have reached the same conclusion because he grabbed my arm and said, "We're leaving right now. This thing has been playing with us." We packed up our gear with frantic efficiency, abandoning any pretense of continuing the hunt. As we started our descent back toward the valley, I couldn't resist one last look through the binoculars. The wolf was still there, sitting now like some ancient sentinel, watching our retreat with what I swear looked like satisfaction. The hike back to our truck took us 6 hours of non-stop walking. Both of us were constantly checking the ridge lines and tree lines around us. We didn't speak much during the descent, but I could tell Dad was processing the same unsettling realization that was eating at me. That massive wolf had been orchestrating our entire experience from day one. Every kill site, every strange arrangement of bones, every moment of growing unease had been carefully planned to guide us deeper into its domain until it was ready to reveal itself. When we finally reached the Silverado, Dad threw our gear into the bed with shaking hands and started the engine before I'd even closed my door. As we drove away, I watched the wilderness disappear in the side mirror, and I swear I could still feel those golden eyes tracking our movement. We never went back to that area, and Dad sold his hunting gear the following spring. Neither of us ever talked about what we'd experienced, but I know we both understood that we'd encountered something that shouldn't exist. An apex predator with intelligence that bordered on supernatural. And we'd been incredibly lucky to leave its territory alive. The Caribou Migration Project seemed like the perfect opportunity to advance my career as a wildlife biologist. After 6 years of smaller research assignments, I finally had the chance to lead a team studying how climate change was disrupting traditional migration routes near the Yukon River. The assignment came through in late April of 2017, and within 2 weeks, I was heading into the Canadian wilderness with a 5-person research team. We were tasked with monitoring 43 GPS-collared caribou over 3 weeks, documenting their movements and behavior patterns. The data we collected would potentially influence conservation policies across the entire region, making this one of the most important projects I'd ever been involved in. I remember feeling this mixture of excitement and responsibility as we loaded our gear, thermal drones, tracking equipment, camping supplies for an extended stay in some seriously remote territory. Our base camp was established at an old logging site that had been abandoned sometime in the 1980s. The location was ideal for our research purposes: flat ground for equipment setup, close proximity to the river for water access, and positioned directly along one of the main caribou migration corridors. But the place had this unsettling atmosphere that I couldn't quite shake. Rusted machinery sat half-buried under decades of moss and fallen leaves, while rotting wooden structures slowly surrendered to the encroaching forest. My team consisted of Dr. James Mitchell, our experienced project leader, Lisa Chen from the university's wildlife department, and 2 graduate students named Alex and Maria. We'd collaborated on previous assignments, so there was an established workflow to how we organized our campsite, distributed daily responsibilities, and settled into our research routine. The first few days proceeded exactly according to plan, with clear, consistent GPS signals streaming in from all the tagged animals. The work itself was methodical and rewarding. Every morning, we'd check our tracking systems while drinking coffee around the portable camp stove, watching dozens of red dots move across our digital maps. The caribou were following their expected routes, clustering in feeding areas during the day and moving steadily northward each night. Lisa handled the thermal drone flights, capturing behavioral footage that would complement our GPS data. Alex and Maria took turns monitoring the radio frequencies, while Dr. Mitchell and I analyzed movement patterns and updated our field notes. The weather held steady: cool mornings, warm afternoons, and crystal clear nights, perfect for equipment operation. By day 5, we documented some fascinating deviations from historical migration patterns, exactly the kind of data that would make our research valuable. The routine was comfortable, predictable, and everything was going according to our carefully planned schedule. During those first several days, I started noticing small details about the abandoned logging site that hadn't been immediately apparent. There were these perfectly straight cut marks on certain trees, far too precise to be natural, suggesting the loggers had used some kind of advanced equipment for their time. The concrete foundations of demolished buildings formed geometric patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if whoever had designed the original layout had some specific organizational system in mind. Most intriguingly, we found several metal plates buried under decades of debris, each one stamped with sequential numbers, but no company identification or dates. Dr. Mitchell mentioned that logging operations from that era typically left more obvious traces, marked trees, equipment serial numbers, proper signage, but this place was different, almost sterile in how thoroughly it had been cleared of identifying information. Still, it didn't interfere with our research, and we had more pressing concerns than investigating the site's mysterious past. Everything changed on the night of May 15th. I was reviewing data logs in my tent around 11:30 p.m. when Alex came running from the monitoring station, his face pale in the lantern light. "Heather, you need to see this right now," he said, his voice tight with concern. All 43 GPS signals had disappeared simultaneously at exactly 11:17 p.m., not gradually, not one by one, but all at once, as if someone had flipped a switch. The tracking system showed no error messages, no equipment malfunctions, no technical explanations for the sudden blackout. Lisa ran diagnostics on our receivers while Dr. Mitchell checked the backup systems, but everything on our end was functioning perfectly. We spent the next 3 hours trying to reestablish contact, adjusting frequencies, boosting signal strength, even attempting manual pings to individual callers. Nothing worked. The caribou had simply vanished from our monitoring network, leaving us staring at empty screens and wondering what the hell had just happened. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced in the wilderness. Usually, the Canadian forest at night is alive with sounds: owls calling, branches creaking, small animals rustling through the undergrowth. But after the signals disappeared, even those familiar noises seemed to fade away, replaced by an oppressive quiet that made my ears ring. We decided to take shifts monitoring the equipment through the night, hoping the signals might return as mysteriously as they'd vanished. Dr. Mitchell took the first watch, followed by Lisa, then Alex. When my turn came at 4 a.m., I sat alone in the monitoring tent, surrounded by silent equipment and trying to make sense of what had happened. The GPS system had never failed so completely before, and the timing, all signals cutting out at the exact same moment, suggested something far more serious than a simple technical glitch. I kept checking and rechecking our data logs, hoping to find some pattern or explanation that we'd missed. Dawn brought no relief, just more questions. We packed up quickly and headed out to the last known location of the nearest caribou herd, about 6 miles northeast of our camp. The hike through the dense forest was tense, everyone lost in their own thoughts about what we might find. When we reached the area, there was no sign of the animals. No tracks, no droppings, no evidence they'd ever been there. Our equipment, however, was undisturbed, sitting exactly where we'd left it the previous day. Cameras, motion sensors, even the backup GPS units were all functioning normally, still recording data from their positions. It was as if the caribou had simply evaporated, leaving behind only the technology we'd used to monitor them. Lisa suggested we expand our search radius, but Dr. Mitchell was already looking worried about our timeline and resources. We spent the entire day searching a 12-mile area, finding nothing but empty wilderness and the growing certainty that something unprecedented had occurred. That evening, Lisa decided to review the thermal drone footage from the previous night. hoping to find some clue about what had happened to the caribou. We gathered around her laptop in the main tent, watching hours of grainy infrared video. Most of it showed exactly what we expected: empty forest, occasional small animals moving through the underbrush, the normal thermal signatures of a quiet wilderness night. But at 11:15 p.m., just 2 minutes before the GPS signals disappeared, the footage captured something extraordinary. 7 tall figures emerged from the tree line, moving in perfect synchronization across the open area near our camp. They were definitely humanoid, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too coordinated, moving with a fluid precision that seemed almost mechanical. The thermal signatures showed they were warmer than the surrounding environment, but cooler than normal human body temperature. Most disturbing was how they moved together like a single organism with multiple parts, maintaining exact spacing and identical movements as they crossed the frame and disappeared back into the forest on the opposite side. None of us spoke for several minutes after the footage ended. Dr. Mitchell rewound it 3 times, studying every detail, while Alex kept muttering that the equipment had to have malfunctioned. But Lisa and I both knew what we were seeing was real. The thermal imaging was too consistent, too detailed to be some kind of technical glitch. The figures were approximately 8 feet tall, with elongated limbs and movements that suggested they were intimately familiar with the terrain. They made no sound that the drone's audio equipment could detect, moving across fallen logs and dense undergrowth without even rustling a single leaf. What haunted me most was their coordination, not just walking in formation, but actually mirroring each other's movements down to the smallest gesture. When the lead figure raised what appeared to be its arm, all 7 performed the exact same motion simultaneously. We watched the clip dozens of times, but it only raised more questions about what we were dealing with and whether it was connected to the caribou disappearance. That night, we implemented a buddy system. No one was allowed to leave their tent alone, and we established regular check-ins every hour until dawn. Despite our precautions, I barely slept, listening to every sound outside and wondering if those figures were still out there watching us. Around 3:00 a.m., I heard Maria whispering urgently to Alex in the tent next to mine. But when I called out to ask if everything was okay, she said she just had a bad dream. The rest of the night passed without incident, but morning brought a new horror that made the previous day's mysteries seem trivial. When we gathered for breakfast at 7:00 a.m., Alex was gone. His sleeping bag was empty, his personal belongings still neatly arranged beside his cot, and his boots were missing. We searched the immediate area around camp, calling his name and checking all the places he might have wandered during the night. Dr. Mitchell was already talking about contacting emergency services when I decided to check the riverbank, thinking maybe Alex had gone for water and slipped on the muddy slope. What I found at the water's edge defied every logical explanation I could think of. Alex's hiking boots were placed with mathematical precision on a flat rock, positioned perfectly parallel to each other and facing directly toward the flowing water. The laces were tied in neat bows, exactly as he always wore them, and there wasn't a single scuff mark or piece of mud on the leather. But there were no footprints, not leading to the boots, not leading away from them, nothing in the soft riverbank soil that would indicate how they'd gotten there. The rock they sat on was completely dry, despite the morning mist that had dampened everything else in the area. I called the others over, and we spent 2 hours examining every inch of the surrounding ground, looking for any trace of Alex's passage. The absence of tracks was absolute and impossible. Even if someone had deliberately erased footprints, there would be signs of the erasure itself. Yet, the boots sat there like a carefully arranged display, as if they'd been placed by someone who could move without touching the ground. We packed up camp immediately and hiked back to the nearest communication point to contact the authorities. The search and rescue operation lasted 4 days, involving helicopters, tracking dogs, and experienced wilderness teams. But no trace of Alex was ever found. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead, with the working theory being that he'd somehow fallen into the river and been swept away by the current. But that explanation didn't account for the boots, which the investigators dismissed as irrelevant details. 6 months later, I received a call from a forestry worker who'd been conducting surveys in the same area. He'd found something buried under a pile of stones near the old logging site, a GPS collar, still functional, with data showing it had been stationary in that exact location since May 15th at 11:17 p.m. It was one of the collars from our missing caribou, and the timing matched perfectly with when all the signals had disappeared. I never went back to that site, and I've never worked another research project in that region. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Every time someone mentions Alaska, my stomach twists into knots. People always picture the beautiful wilderness and amazing northern lights, but all I can think about is that night at Copper Creek Lodge. At the time, I was fresh out of my junior year at college, working a seasonal job as a front desk clerk and maintenance helper at this tiny remote lodge near Wrangell St. Elias National Park. It was June 22, and the place was basically my entire world for 3 months. The lodge had 12 small cabins scattered around the property, connected by gravel paths that crunched under your feet, no matter how quietly you tried to walk. Our nearest neighbor was 40 miles away, and cell service was absolutely non-existent. The only connection to the outside world was a single landline in the main office that crackled with static on good days. Most nights, the silence was so complete, it felt like we were the only people left on Earth. The guests that week were mostly hikers and photographers, the kind of people who came to Alaska specifically to get away from civilization. There was this trio, a couple, David and Amanda, who'd been staying in Cabin 7 for 3 days with their friend Troy. David was one of those guys who never seemed to stop talking, always cracking jokes and making everyone laugh during meals in the main lodge. Amanda was quieter, more reserved, but she had this way of watching everything around her like she was constantly taking mental notes. Troy was somewhere in between, friendly enough, but kept to himself most of the time. They'd spend their days hiking the trails around the property and come back every evening completely exhausted, covered in mud and mosquito bites. The dynamic between them seemed normal enough, just 3 friends on a wilderness adventure. But there was this underlying tension I couldn't quite put my finger on, especially between David and Troy. The day everything went wrong started like any other. I'd spent most of it fixing a busted water heater in Cabin 3 and restocking supplies in the main lodge. The weather had been unusually warm for June, and by evening, the air was thick with mosquitoes and that strange twilight that never quite turns to full darkness during Alaskan summers. Around 900 plum, I noticed David, Amanda, and Troy heading toward the bathhouse, which was this small wooden building about 100 yards from the main lodge. Troy was carrying a towel and seemed eager to finally get cleaned up after their long hike. David and Amanda were walking behind him, and I could hear David's voice getting louder as they got farther away. Though I couldn't make out what he was saying, there was something about his tone that made me pause while I was locking up the office, but I shrugged it off. Guests argued sometimes, especially when they were tired and dealing with the isolation. About an hour later, I was in my small staff cabin reading when I heard voices outside. At first, I figured it was just other guests returning from evening activities, but the voices were getting closer and more agitated. Then, I heard Amanda's voice, sharp and panicked, calling out something about Troy being missing. I put down my book and listened more carefully. David was with her, and they were moving from cabin to cabin, knocking on doors and asking if anyone had seen Troy. Their voices had this frantic edge that made the hair on my arm stand up. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. And that's when Amanda spotted me. She came running over, her face pale even in the dim light, with David right behind her with this wild look in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Amanda kept saying Troy had disappeared after some kind of fight near the bathhouse, but when I asked for details, both of them seemed to stumble over their words. The story they told me kept changing every time I asked a question. First, Amanda said Troy had gotten into an argument with a stranger who was lurking around the bathhouse. Then, David jumped in and said the stranger had been there for hours just watching people come and go. But when I asked what this stranger looked like, Amanda described a tall man with dark hair, while David insisted he was shorter with a beard. Their descriptions were so different, it was like they were talking about completely different people. Amanda kept wringing her hands and looking around nervously, while David was pacing back and forth, running his fingers through his hair repeatedly. The whole situation felt wrong, like they were performing some kind of rehearsed panic rather than genuinely worried about their friend. I told them we should check the bathhouse first, and maybe Troy had just wandered off to cool down after whatever argument had happened. But as we walked toward the building, I noticed David kept glancing at Amanda with these quick, meaningful looks that made my skin crawl. The bathhouse was completely empty when we got there, but there were clear signs of some kind of struggle. The wooden bench outside was overturned, and there were scuff marks in the dirt that looked like someone had been dragged or had fallen hard. Amanda immediately started crying and saying they needed to call the police. But when I suggested we use the landline in the main office, David quickly said we should search the property first. He insisted that Troy probably just went for a walk to clear his head and would be back any minute. But the way he said it, with this forced calm in his voice, made me realize he was trying to control the situation. I agreed to help them search, but I was already planning to call the authorities as soon as we got back to the lodge. The three of us spent the next hour combing through the trails with flashlights, calling Troy's name and getting no response. Every shadow seemed threatening, and every sound made us jump. Amanda kept asking what we were going to do, but David kept steering the conversation away from calling for help. When we finally gave up the search around midnight, I was exhausted and genuinely worried about Troy. I told David and Amanda that I was going to call the state troopers from the main office, and that's when David's whole demeanor changed. He grabbed my arm and said we should wait until morning, that Troy would probably show up on his own, and we'd just be wasting everyone's time. But Amanda disagreed, saying they needed to call Troy's family and let them know what was happening. The two of them started arguing right there in front of me, and I could hear the desperation in both their voices. David kept insisting that calling the police would just make things worse, while Amanda was practically begging him to let me make the call. During their argument, I noticed David had scratches on his forearms that definitely weren't there earlier in the day, and when I asked him about them, he claimed he'd gotten them while pushing through some bushes during our search, but the scratches looked fresh and deep, like fingernail marks, and they were in a pattern that made me think of someone trying to defend themselves. I finally convinced them that we needed to contact the authorities, and the three of us walked back to the main lodge together. The building felt eerily quiet as I unlocked the office door, and I could hear both David and Amanda breathing heavily behind me. When I picked up the landline phone to dial, there was no dial tone, just complete silence. I jiggled the cord and checked all the connections, but the line was completely dead. David immediately said the phone lines probably went down because of the weather, but there hadn't been any storms that day. Amanda was getting more agitated by the minute, pacing around the small office and muttering about how they needed to get help somehow. I told them I'd drive to the nearest town in the morning to report Troy missing, but David quickly volunteered to go instead. He said he knew the area better and could get there faster, but something about his eagerness to leave made me suspicious. I insisted that we all stay together until we figured out what had happened to Troy. And that's when I noticed David and Amanda exchange another one of those loaded glances. We decided to wait until dawn before making any decisions, and I offered to let them stay in the main lodge instead of going back to their cabin. Amanda accepted immediately, but David seemed reluctant, saying he wanted to go back and get some of their things. I watched him walk toward cabin 7, and something about the way he moved, quick and purposeful, made me decide to follow him at a distance. I grabbed my flashlight and snuck out the back door of the lodge, staying in the shadows as I made my way toward their cabin. David went inside for maybe 10 minutes, and when he came out, he was carrying a large duffel bag that looked much heavier than it should have been if he was just getting clothes. He also had something wrapped in a towel tucked under his arm, and he kept looking around nervously as he walked back. I managed to get back to the lodge before him, but I pretended to be dozing in one of the lobby chairs when he returned. Amanda was curled up on the couch, but I could tell she wasn't really sleeping either. The three of us spent the rest of the night in that main room, and I don't think any of us got a minute of real sleep. When the sun finally came up around 4:30 a.m., I suggested we all walk back to the bathhouse area in the daylight to see if we could find any more clues about what happened to Troy. David immediately protested, saying we'd already searched thoroughly and wouldn't find anything new. But Amanda stood up and said she wanted to look again, and after a moment of hesitation, David agreed to come with us. As we walked toward the bathhouse, I noticed David kept positioning himself between Amanda and me, like he was trying to control what we could see or where we could go. The morning light revealed details we'd missed in the dark. There were drops of what looked like dried liquid on the wooden steps of the bathhouse, and the ground around the building was more disturbed than I'd initially realized. Amanda pointed out a torn piece of fabric caught on a nearby bush, and when she started to reach for it, David quickly stepped in and said, "We shouldn't touch anything that might be evidence." But the way he said it, with this forced authority in his voice, made me wonder if he was trying to preserve evidence or destroy it. Around 700 a.m., I heard the distant sound of a helicopter approaching, which was unusual since we rarely got air traffic that early in the morning. David's face went completely white when he heard it, and he started talking rapidly about how they should probably head back to their cabin to pack up and leave. But Amanda was staring at the helicopter with this expression of relief mixed with terror, and she whispered something about hoping it was help. The helicopter landed in the clearing near the main lodge, and 2 state troopers got out along with a paramedic. My first thought was that someone else had called about Troy, but then I realized that was impossible since our phone lines were down. One of the troopers approached us and asked if we were the people who'd reported a missing person, and before I could answer, David jumped in and said there had been a misunderstanding. He claimed Troy had just wandered off for a walk and had probably already made it back to town on his own. The trooper looked skeptical and asked to speak with each of us separately, starting with Amanda. While Amanda was talking to the officers, David kept trying to convince me that we should tell them everything was fine and that Troy would turn up eventually. He was sweating despite the cool morning air, and he kept fidgeting with something in his pocket. But then the paramedic came over and told us they'd found Troy about 2 miles downstream near the old mining road. He was alive but in critical condition with multiple stab wounds, and they'd already airlifted him to a hospital in Fairbanks. The paramedic said Troy had managed to crawl to the road and flag down a passing truck driver who'd called for help on his CB radio. When I looked at David after hearing this news, his face had gone completely gray, and he was staring at the ground like he was trying to disappear. Amanda started crying, but they weren't tears of relief. They were tears of fear. The troopers arrested David that afternoon after finding the knife wrapped in the towel he'd retrieved from their cabin, and Amanda confessed that she'd helped him move Troy's body after the attack. She said David had snapped during an argument about money Troy owed him, and they'd panicked when they thought he was dead. The phone line had been cut with wire cutters found in David's bag. Amanda got a reduced sentence for cooperating, but David was charged with attempted murder. I quit my job the next day and never went back to Alaska. Sometimes I still wake up wondering what would have happened if that truck driver hadn't found Troy in time. Music. Most summers, my Uncle Tim would take me out fishing somewhere remote in Alaska. He's the kind of guy who thinks Wi-Fi is a government trick and that real life starts when your boots hit mud. That particular trip, we were camped just outside Bethel, along a bend in the Kuskokwim River, where the bank slopes down in a jagged mess of roots and packed silt. I'd just turned 13 that spring, and it was my first time getting my own gear rod, boots, even a small fillet knife. I remember feeling proud, like I'd finally earned a spot alongside the grown-ups, even if I still had to sleep in the smaller tent. It was early afternoon, and Tim had hiked upriver a ways to check some traps, leaving me with instructions not to wander far and to keep the fire going. The sun was out, but hazy, filtered through low clouds that made everything look softer, quieter. I'd set up by the water with my tackle box and a half-warm thermos of black coffee. I wasn't really supposed to be drinking. The current was slow that day, dragging bits of moss and driftwood in wide arcs. And I remember watching the surface like it was a movie. No phone, no distractions, just that steady hush of water and wind. Then someone called out from the trees behind me. At first, I thought it was Tim messing with me. The voice had that friendly but strange tone, like someone trying not to spook a stray dog. When I turned, I saw a man standing halfway down the slope leading into the brush. He had on this camo jacket that looked like it had been dipped in mud and forgotten for years, and a wool beanie stretched over his head like he'd pulled it on without checking if it fit. I didn't recognize him. He wasn't from the campgrounds or from the small shop we stopped at in town. He smiled with his mouth open just enough to show a missing canine tooth and said he was a local guide. Claimed he was moving gear for a group of hunters and needed a second pair of hands. There was something about how still he stood while talking that didn't sit right with me. His feet never shifted. His hands stayed behind his back, even when he gestured with his chin toward the trees. I asked which outfitter he worked for, and he dodged the question like I'd asked for his social security number. Then he laughed, this dry, shallow sound, and said I looked strong enough to carry a couple of crates. He pointed deeper into the woods, saying it wasn't far, just past a ridge. I remember feeling my knees tense, not with fear exactly, but like my body had already made a decision before my brain caught up. I told him I needed to grab my boots, stalling really, but he stepped forward like he hadn't heard me. Only a few feet, but it felt way too close. His boots sank into the soft dirt near the edge of the water, leaving deep, wide prints like he'd been pacing that shoreline for a while. That's when I noticed the back of his pants were soaked up to the thighs, and not from walking through shallow river water. It was darker, muddier, like he'd been kneeling somewhere wet for too long. He glanced toward the trail again, but there wasn't any gear in sight. Just thick brush and a mess of alder branches snapped low, like someone had pushed through them fast and recently. I said no. I didn't even think about it. Just said it out loud, firm and clear, the way my uncle had told me to speak if something ever felt wrong. The man didn't respond right away. He just kept standing there, staring like I hadn't spoken at all. His face didn't change, but his jaw clenched once, quick. Then he sort of laughed through his nose and muttered something under his breath that sounded like, "They never learn." That's when I backed away, careful not to turn around, keeping the river behind me as a kind of barrier. I felt this weird pressure, like I had to keep talking or moving or doing something because silence felt dangerous. I walked backward until I hit a log that marked the trail back to camp. That's when he took one more step toward me, slow, deliberate, and said, "You don't want to be out here alone when it gets dark." It wasn't a threat, not exactly. More like he was stating a fact. His tone was flat and weirdly calm, like he was reciting a weather report. I didn't answer. I just turned and ran. I didn't check if he followed. I didn't hear footsteps, but I also didn't trust the quiet. The trees seemed thicker on the way back, like they were leaning in, and I remember ducking under branches that hadn't been low before. By the time I reached the tents, I couldn't tell if I'd been gone 10 minutes or an hour. Everything looked the same, but it all felt off balance, like the world had been nudged slightly sideways. I didn't see Tim anywhere, and for a second, I panicked, thinking maybe that man had gotten to him, too. But then I saw smoke curling up from the fire pit. He came out from behind the truck a few seconds later, holding a wrench, wiping grease off his fingers. He asked if I'd caught anything. I told him no, and that we needed to pack up early. He frowned, probably wondering why I was suddenly in such a hurry, but I didn't feel like explaining. I just wanted to get out of there. "Why so soon, kiddo? We just got here." He wiped his brow with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of grease across his forehead. "Besides, the fish are just starting to bite this time of day." "I don't feel good, Uncle Tim," I said, forcing my voice to sound shaky. "I think I'm getting a fever." He squinted at me, his eyes narrowed with concern. He always did worry about me, especially when we were out in the middle of nowhere. "Well, let me have a look at you." He reached out and touched my forehead, his hand rough but gentle. "You do feel a little warm," he said, his voice softening. "All right, kiddo, we'll pack up. No use staying if you're under the weather. Besides," he added with a wink, "I'm always up for an excuse to head back to town for some decent grub." He started gathering our gear, his movements efficient and practiced. Even though he seemed skeptical about my sudden illness, he didn't push it. He knew that sometimes kids just got spooked, especially out in the wilderness. As we packed, I kept glancing back towards the woods, half expecting to see that man standing there, watching us. But there was nothing, just the silent trees and the fading sunlight. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed, that something was out there, lurking in the shadows. By the time we were ready to leave, the sky was starting to darken, and the air had grown colder. I hurried into the truck, eager to get away from that place. As we drove off, I looked back one last time, but the trees had swallowed up the campsite, leaving no trace of our presence. All that remained was the unsettling memory of the man with the missing tooth and the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something sinister. For weeks afterward, I had nightmares about those woods and the man who waited in them. I never told my uncle the full story, afraid he wouldn't believe me or that he'd think I was just being a scared kid. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew that something wasn't right. And even now, years later, I still get a shiver down my spine whenever I think about that day on the Kuskokwim River and the stranger who knew more than he let on. The thermal footage replayed in my head, each detail sharper and more unsettling than the last. Dr. Mitchell seemed determined to dissect every pixel, rewinding and fast-forwarding, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It's gotta be some kind of equipment malfunction," Alex insisted, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. There's no way those things are real. Lisa and I exchanged a look. Alex's denial was almost comical, a desperate attempt to cling to the rational in the face of the inexplicable. But we both knew better. The thermal imaging was too precise, too consistent. This wasn't some random glitch. This was something tangible, something real. The figures in the footage were undeniably imposing. 8 feet tall, with limbs that seemed disproportionately long. They moved with an unsettling grace, navigating the rugged terrain as if they were born to it. They moved without sound, like ghosts in a silent movie. The way they moved across the fallen logs and through the undergrowth, they did so without a rustle or a snap, and not so much as a disturbed leaf left in their wake. But it was their coordination that truly unnerved me. They didn't just walk in formation, they mirrored each other's movements with eerie precision. When the lead figure raised what could only be described as an arm, the other 6 mimicked the gesture simultaneously, as if controlled by a single mind. We must have watched that clip dozens of times, but with each viewing, the questions only multiplied. What were these creatures? Where did they come from? And, most importantly, what did their presence have to do with the disappearance of the caribou? The fact that the signals had abruptly ended in a similar pattern to this current situation didn't sit well with me. That night, sleep was a luxury we couldn't afford. Fear permeated the campsite, thick and suffocating. We established a buddy system, a desperate attempt to provide a semblance of safety in the face of the unknown. No one was to venture outside their tent alone, and we agreed on hourly check-ins, a chorus of whispered assurances echoing through the darkness until dawn. Despite our best efforts, sleep eluded me. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent my heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that those figures were out there, lurking in the shadows, their thermal eyes fixed on our vulnerable camp. Around 300 a.m., the silence was broken by the hushed urgency of Maria's voice. She was whispering to Alex in the tent next to mine, her words indistinct but laced with apprehension. "Maria, everything okay?" I called out, my voice strained with sleep. "Just a bad dream," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything's fine." I wasn't convinced, but I didn't press it. I was sure they could feel my eyes drilling holes in their tent wall as I listened intently for any further disturbances. The rest of the night passed without incident, each agonizing minute stretching into an eternity. But the morning brought a new horror, a chilling revelation that made the previous day's mysteries seem almost insignificant. When we gathered for breakfast at 700 A, Alex was nowhere to be found. His sleeping bag lay empty, neatly folded, and his personal belongings were arranged beside his cot with unsettling precision. But the most disturbing detail was the absence of his boots. A wave of panic washed over us as we searched the immediate vicinity of the camp, calling his name, our voices cracking with fear and desperation. We checked every possible place he might have wandered during the night, every hidden corner, every shadowed crevice. Dr. Mitchell, his face pale and drawn, was already talking about contacting emergency services, his voice a shaky monotone. When I decided to check the riverbank, it was a long shot, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the river held the key to Alex's disappearance. Maybe he had gone for water and slipped on the muddy slope, I reasoned, clinging to a desperate hope. What I found at the water's edge defied all logic, shattering any semblance of normalcy. Alex's hiking boots sat on a flat rock, positioned with a calculated precision that sent a shiver down my spine. They were perfectly parallel to each other, facing directly toward the flowing water, and the laces were tied in neat bows, just as he always wore them. There wasn't a single scuff mark or speck of mud on the leather, as if they had been meticulously cleaned before being placed on the rock. But the most unnerving thing was the complete absence of footprints. There were no tracks leading to the boots, no tracks leading away from them. The soft riverbank soil was undisturbed, offering no clue as to how the boots had gotten there. The rock they sat on was completely dry, despite the morning mist that had dampened everything else in the area. It was as if the boots had materialized out of thin air, placed there by an unseen hand. I called the others over, my voice trembling with a mixture of fear and disbelief, and we spent the next 2 hours meticulously examining every inch of the surrounding ground, searching for any trace of Alex's passage. But the absence of tracks was absolute, undeniable. Even if someone had deliberately tried to erase footprints, there would have been signs of the erasure itself, some disturbance in the soil, some telltale mark. Yet, the riverbank was pristine, untouched. The boots sat there like a macabre display, a carefully arranged tableau, as if they had been placed there by someone who could move without touching the ground. The decision to abandon the camp was immediate and unanimous. We packed our gear with frantic haste, our movements jerky and uncoordinated, and hiked back to the nearest communication point to contact the authorities. The search and rescue operation that followed was extensive, involving helicopters, tracking dogs, and experienced wilderness teams, but no trace of Alex was ever found. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead, the working theory being that he had somehow fallen into the river and been swept away by the current. But that explanation didn't account for the boots. The investigators dismissed them as irrelevant details, circumstantial evidence that didn't fit their neat narrative of accidental drowning. But I knew better. The boots were a message, a chilling reminder that something unnatural had occurred at Copper Creek. 6 months later, I received a call from a forestry worker who had been conducting surveys in the same area. He had found something buried under a pile of stones near the old logging site, a GPS collar. It was still functional, and the data showed that it had been stationary in that exact location since May 15th at 11:17 p.m. It was one of the collars from our missing caribou, and the timing matched perfectly with when all the signals had disappeared. The discovery confirmed my worst fears. Something was hunting in those woods, and it was far more dangerous than we could have ever imagined. I never went back to that site. I never worked another research project in that region. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some doors are better left unopened. The truth, I feared, was far more terrifying than anything I could ever comprehend. And to this day, every time someone mentions Alaska, my stomach twists into knots. People always picture the beautiful wilderness, the pristine landscapes, the awe-inspiring northern lights, but all I can think about is that night at Copper Creek Lodge and the chilling realization that we were not alone. My own memories of Alaska were far less dramatic, at least on the surface, but they were no less unsettling. I was fresh out of my junior year at college at the time. I was working a seasonal job as a front desk clerk and maintenance helper at Copper Creek Lodge. It was a tiny, remote place tucked away near Wrangell St. Elias National Park. It was June 22, and for those 3 months, that lodge was my entire world. It had 12 small cabins scattered around the property. The cabins were all connected by gravel paths that crunched under your feet. No matter how quietly you tried to walk, our nearest neighbor was 40 miles away, and cell service was non-existent. The only connection to the outside world was a single landline in the main office that crackled with static on good days. Most nights, the silence was so complete, so absolute, that it felt like we were the only people left on Earth. The guests that week were mostly hikers and photographers. They were the kind of people who came to Alaska specifically to escape civilization, to immerse themselves in the raw, untamed beauty of the wilderness. Among them was a trio, a couple named David and Amanda and their friend, Troy. They'd been staying in Cabin 7 for 3 days when everything went sideways. David was the extrovert of the group, always cracking jokes and making everyone laugh during meals in the main lodge. Amanda was quieter, more reserved, with a watchful gaze that made you feel like she was constantly taking mental notes. Troy was somewhere in between, friendly enough, but generally kept to himself. They spent their days hiking the trails around the property, returning each evening exhausted, covered in mud and mosquito bites. At first glance, their dynamic seemed normal, just 3 friends on a wilderness adventure, but there was an underlying tension, a subtle undercurrent of unease that I couldn't quite decipher, especially between David and Troy. The day everything went wrong began like any other. I spent most of it fixing a faulty water heater in Cabin 3 and restocking supplies in the main lodge. The weather was unseasonably warm for June, and by evening, the air was thick with mosquitoes and the strange, perpetual twilight that characterizes Alaskan summers. Around 900 Plum, I saw David, Amanda, and Troy heading toward the bathhouse. It was a small, rustic building located about 100 yards from the main lodge. Troy was carrying a towel, looking forward to cleaning himself up after what I assumed was another long hike. David and Amanda walked behind him, their voices growing louder as they moved away from the lodge. Although I couldn't make out the exact words, there was something in David's tone that gave me pause as I locked up the office for the night. It was an aggressive tone. As a former employee of the lodge, I knew that guests argued from time to time, especially when they were tired, hot, and dealing with the isolation that came with being so far from civilization. I shrugged off the nagging feeling that something was wrong. An hour later, I was relaxing in my small staff cabin, engrossed in a book, when I heard voices outside. At first, I assumed it was just other guests returning from an evening hike, but the voices grew closer, more agitated. Then, I heard Amanda's voice, sharp and frantic, calling out that Troy was missing. I dropped my book and listened more intently. David was with her, and they were going from cabin to cabin, knocking on doors and asking if anyone had seen Troy. There was a desperate edge to their voices that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside to see if I could help. Amanda spotted me immediately. She ran toward me, her face pale even in the dim light. David followed close behind, his eyes wild and darting. Amanda kept repeating that Troy had disappeared after some kind of altercation near the bathhouse. But when I pressed them for details, they both seemed to stumble over their words, their stories shifting and contradicting each other with each passing question. At first, Amanda claimed that Troy had gotten into an argument with a stranger who was lurking around the bathhouse. Then, David interjected, stating that the stranger had been there for hours, watching people come and go. But when I asked them to describe the stranger, Amanda offered the description of a tall man with dark hair, while David insisted that he was shorter with a beard. Their descriptions were so disparate that it was as if they were talking about completely different people. Amanda wrung her hands, her eyes darting nervously around the campsite, while David paced back and forth, repeatedly running his fingers through his hair. The whole scenario felt staged, as if they were performing some kind of poorly rehearsed act of panic rather than genuinely worried about their friend. "Let's start with the bathhouse," I said, trying to regain some control of the situation. Maybe he just went for a walk to cool off after whatever happened. But as we walked toward the bathhouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. David kept glancing at Amanda with these quick, significant looks that sent shivers down my spine. It made me feel like I was not supposed to be privy to their conversation. The bathhouse was deserted, but the signs of a struggle were evident. The wooden bench outside was overturned, and there were scuff marks in the dirt that suggested someone had been dragged or had fallen heavily. Amanda immediately burst into tears, insisting that we call the police. But when I suggested using the landline in the main office, David quickly protested, saying that we should search the property first. He claimed that Troy had simply gone for a walk to clear his head and would be back any minute. But the forced calmness in his voice only intensified my suspicions. He was trying to control the situation to prevent us from calling for help. I agreed to assist them in their search, but I knew in my heart that something sinister had happened. I also knew that I was going to call the authorities. Gave me a look, but he didn't put up a fight. We took off that very afternoon. Tim held back on the questions until we were about halfway down that gravel road, heading back towards town. I laid out what had happened as plainly as I could. He went completely quiet, not angry, just locked in, like he was all ready, gave me this knowing look. But she didn't argue with me. We just packed up and left that same afternoon. Tim didn't push me for any real details until we were about halfway down that gravel road heading back toward town. I told him exactly what happened, laid it all out as clearly and simply as I could. He got real quiet then, not angry at all, just intensely focused, like he was already running maps and faces through his head. He started asking what the man looked like, what exactly he had said, and if I could point out the exact spot where it happened. I told him about the guy's soaked pants, the missing tooth, and how he kept his hands hidden, out of sight the whole time. Tim didn't say another word for a while after that. When we finally got back to town, he made a quick stop at the ranger station while I sat there waiting in the truck with the windows cracked, my fishing rod still untouched in the back seat. That night, back at the motel, the news was on in the background while we were eating. I was barely even paying attention until Tim reached for the remote and turned the volume way up. There was a missing persons alert. Some kid named Alex, 15 years old, last seen just outside another campsite, not too far from ours, about 4 days earlier. No real solid leads, but the news report mentioned he was last spotted talking to some man in camouflage, possibly a local guy. The photo of that missing kid hit me hard. He was taller than me, but there was something about his expression that felt so familiar. Just a normal teenager, probably trying to have a good time out in the woods. He probably didn't think his afternoon was about to go sideways like that. I didn't sleep worth a damn that night. I kept thinking about how quickly things could have turned really bad if I'd said yes to that guy, if I'd followed him, if I'd hesitated for even one more second. It's not like I did anything especially heroic, though I just listened to that little voice inside that gets all tense and tight when something just doesn't feel right. I still think about that man's voice sometimes. The calm way he told me that I didn't want to be alone out there. Not angry, not frustrated, just utterly certain. Like he wasn't guessing how things were going to end. He already knew. We haven't been back to that spot since then. Tim said we were going to stick to places closer to town for a while. I never saw that man again. And as far as I know, no one was ever arrested. The other boy, Alex, was never found. His name still comes up sometimes in online forums like this one, and every single time it does, I think about saying something, about reporting the interaction again. But the truth is, I've already said everything that I know, and maybe posting here now is just my way of reminding anyone who's reading this to trust that gut feeling, even when it doesn't make a whole lot of sense in the moment, and especially when it doesn't. I still don't know for sure why I didn't turn around that day. Part of me thinks it was just denial, plain and simple. I didn't want to admit that something was wrong, We were supposed to be heading down to a wrestling tournament in Satna. Just me and my son, Mason. He was 16 at the time, really big into sports, always tossing his gym bag in the back seat like he owned the whole damn world. I'd taken the whole weekend off from my dental office, packed us both up, filled the gas tank at a Chevron station near Kenny Spur Road, and figured we'd make really good time before sunset. The drive down from our town was familiar. We'd done it twice before for other school events. I remember specifically telling myself that it was going to be a nice, quiet ride. Maybe even a good chance for us to just talk without all the usual distractions. We were maybe 30 minutes south of Sterling when I first noticed the pickup truck. It had dark-tinted windows and an older, matte gray paint job. Nothing flashy or eye-catching, just generic enough to blend right in. It slipped into my lane behind us somewhere past the last gas station. At first, I didn't think all that much of it. The highway's long and mostly empty, and vehicles sometimes stick together for miles and miles. But this one was staying way too close. I checked the rearview mirror more than once, fully expecting it to pass us at any moment. But it never did. I even nudged the car over to the right shoulder a little bit, slowing down enough to invite the truck to go around. Instead, the driver just matched my speed exactly, keeping the same unnervingly tight distance, almost like he was somehow tethered to us. I pointed it out to Mason, trying my best not to sound too nervous about it. He was looking down at his phone, but he glanced up and just muttered something like, "Creeper vibes." And he wasn't wrong. I tested the situation again, sped up a little bit, then dropped back down to under the speed limit. The truck mirrored every single move I made. I even tapped the brakes twice, a trick my dad used to use to warn tailgaters. No change whatsoever. I switched lanes for no real reason, still right behind us. It wasn't aggressive at all, though, just incredibly deliberate. And that's what made it even worse. There was no honking, no flashing lights, no engine revving, just that constant, relentless pressure right behind us, like we were being herded somewhere. I really didn't want to panic in front of Mason, but I could feel this cold, sinking feeling starting to grow inside me. This wasn't just some random person zoning out on the highway. It was something else entirely. It was too late to turn back, and the cell signal was super weak in that stretch of road. I told Mason to open up the Maps app on his phone and look for the nearest place we could pull over that had lights, maybe a store or a rest area. We found a rest stop about 10 minutes ahead. It was barely even marked on the map, just a faded, almost unnoticeable icon. But it was still better than just staying in motion with this guy glued to our back bumper. I tried my best to stay calm, or at least appear that way. My knuckles were starting to ache from how tightly I was gripping the steering wheel. The rest stop was nothing at all like I'd hoped it would be. It was just a gravel pull-off with one flickering street lamp, a rusted-out vending machine that probably hadn't worked since the early 2000s, and a single unmarked porta-potty that was tilted slightly in the mud. No other cars, no people at all, just the wind moving through the trees and the dull, low hum of the nearby river. I slowed down and pulled in anyway, figuring that if the truck passed us by, I'd just wait a few minutes before getting back on the road. But it didn't pass us. It followed us in, slow, steady, and confident. I could feel Mason sitting up straighter in his seat. I could tell he was trying to act like he wasn't fazed by any of it, but I saw the way he was holding his breath. The truck didn't park right next to us. It angled itself in behind my car, effectively cutting off our exit, like the driver had rehearsed the whole move. I didn't recognize the model exactly, some older Chevy or GMC truck, maybe late 90s, but there was definitely something strange about the front grille. It looked homemade, almost reinforced, like someone had welded extra bars across it. My headlights were reflecting off of the tinted windshield, but I couldn't see anything inside the cab. No movement at all. No door opening. Just the truck sitting there, engine still running. The low, idle rumbling through the quiet air like some kind of a warning. I told Mason, "Don't get out," and grabbed my cell phone. Still no signal. Mason whispered that he was already recording everything. He'd flipped his phone camera around and angled it low against the dashboard, barely even moving his hand. I didn't even have to ask him to do it. He just did it. Smart kid. I told him to keep filming no matter what happened. I was just about to honk the horn, just once, to maybe scare whoever it was or to alert someone nearby, even though I seriously doubted anyone would even hear it. But before I could do it, the driver's side door of the truck cracked open a little bit. Not all the way, just a few inches. Then it slammed shut again. Nothing else happened. No one got out. I couldn't fully explain the move, but it felt very calculated, like they were letting us know they were watching us, sizing us up, deciding what to do. That was the exact moment that it stopped feeling like paranoia to me and started feeling like a trap. I really didn't want to try reversing into them, but we were completely boxed in. There was a steep ditch to the right and dense trees on the left. I kept thinking that if I drove forward over the grass, I'd probably just get stuck in the mud. So I just stayed right there, engine running, doors locked tight. The truck then crept forward just an inch, and I couldn't help it anymore. I just yelled, "What the hell do you want?" Mason grabbed my arm, trying to calm me down, and whispered, "Mom, wait." The driver still didn't move at all. Just that engine humming away like it had all the time in the world. Out of pure, raw instinct, I leaned on the horn, long and loud. It echoed across the trees and all the way out to the empty highway beyond. That finally did something. The truck jolted backward, then reversed really fast, kicking up gravel behind it. It didn't leave the parking lot entirely, though it stopped again right by the exit. Halfway turned toward the road, like the driver couldn't decide whether to run away or wait for us. I threw the car into drive, aimed it straight at the ditch, and just floored it. The wheels bounced hard over the edge. The undercarriage scraped along the ground, but we made it through the muddy patch and out onto the far side of the rest stop. I didn't look back at all until I was back on the highway again. When I finally checked the rearview mirror, the truck was gone. Not on the road behind us. Not still in the parking lot. Just completely vanished. Mason stopped recording on his phone, and we drove the next 20 minutes in silence until we finally hit a more populated area, and I could finally breathe again. I pulled into a busy grocery store parking lot and made him send that video to my email address, just in case anything happened to his phone. We just sat there for a while before I called the police. I honestly didn't even care if they thought I was being overly dramatic. I knew that what we had just experienced wasn't normal at all. It wasn't road rage. It wasn't a prank. It was something much darker and more sinister. The state trooper who met us took it seriously, though I showed him the footage, and he actually recognized the truck right away. He didn't give us the full story, but he said that the driver matched the description of someone they'd been trying to locate for months, connected to at least 3 other roadside harassment reports along the Kenai Peninsula, always late afternoons, always targeting women who were driving alone or with their kids. Nothing had ever escalated to any real violence, but the behavior was definitely getting worse and worse. He said that Mason's video was the clearest evidence they had so far, and that it might finally give them what they needed to make an arrest. We never heard what happened after that. They never followed up with us, probably for legal reasons or something, but I've never driven that stretch of highway again, not without someone else in the passenger seat and a full tank of gas in the car. Mason stopped asking if he could drive alone, too. He still jokes around that he saved the day with his phone camera. And maybe he's right about that. That little bit of quick thinking might have kept us from becoming just another case that they never solved. I just hope that whoever was behind that steering wheel, whoever thought that that kind of thing was just some kind of a game, realizes that they picked the wrong car that night. Music.